Mike, it's really good to see you. And for people who don't know, Mike was part of our NFL Nation group covering the Bills for a while, did a great job. Now covers the Crimson Tide in Alabama. And so Washington, of course, has two players that they selected from there. They went back to their farm system, so to speak, and get Phidarian Mathis and then Brian Robinson. And I want to start with Mathis. And first thing is, and he seems like a big personality. And it's funny because he told us Phidarian, he spelled it out for us. He said, there's no L. Then I look on his Twitter feed and he calls himself Phil. So like, I don't know what, but anyway, he seems like a personality, seems like a good player. In general, Mike, what is Washington getting with Phidarian Mathis?
Yeah, well, we always called him Phil, and then I kind of had to remember if I was writing, I had to write it as Phidarian, which I almost had to remember how to spell it because I never actually called him that. But he's Phil, and yeah, he's a player who I think can really fit either into a 3-4 as a defensive end or 4-3 as a tackle. If you're in a sub package, he's probably more of an interior guy. So he's a guy who I think, at Alabama, you look back at. I remember doing this because we were talking about Evan Neal as a potential number 1 overall pick at Alabama. And we were looking and we're saying who was the highest draft pick of the Saban era. And it was two guys. It was Quinnen Williams and Marcel Darius, who are both defensive tackles, both guys who are penetrators and could really disrupt plays. And that's why they went number 3 overall. Mathis is not in that category. He's not as disruptive of a player as those guys were. He's not going to wreak havoc in the way that an Aaron Donald or one of those real interior pass rushers can. It's just not his style. I think he's more of a 2-gapper guy who can kind of hold blocks, hold the line a little bit, more of a run defender than I would say a pass rusher. Especially even you look at last year, Christian Barmore going out in the second round, went to the Patriots. That was because he was rushing the passer. I think Mathis is a second round pick because of the size of his body, because of his sturdiness against the run, and because of some of the intangibles that I think he brings just as a leader. He was voted as a team captain last year. There's always 4 permanent team captains at Alabama. So he was one of those 4, has his handprint in concrete on the campus now in Alabama and his cleat print. So he's a guy who I think players respected in that locker room. He's a leader, just a reliable player off the field, but also a reliable player on the field, but not really a spectacular sort of game wrecking sort of player.
One of the things that attracted Washington to him is going back to what you said, holding the blocks. And I know like there was a thought, did he go too high at 47? And I know some people that I talked to thought he would be a 3rd round pick. They didn't have a 3rd round pick till late. They liked him there, so they took him. One of the things that attracted Washington to Mathis, and when I talked to somebody here and they said when they talked to the Alabama coaches, the coaches used the word selfless with him, and that he was really good at taking on the double teams, like you said. I think that's something because they watch Christian Harris and they'd see, well, he's making these big plays. Well, why is that? Well, he's oftentimes clean to the ball, and they would go back and say, who is letting him be clean? And it's oftentimes Mathis. Is that kind of what he did really well for Alabama? And is that what you'd hear from coaches there?
Definitely, yeah. And that's really what I think the role is for him in the Alabama defense, because they still run the 3-4 where, the defensive linemen, if there are 3 of them on the field, sometimes it's only 2, because of sub packages. But in general, what Alabama wants is their defensive linemen to just occupy space, to be those pluggers up front and allow the linebackers to do what they do, which in Alabama's case, they have 2 really good ones on the inside, like you mentioned, in Harris and Henry To'oTo'o, then 2 really good pass rushers outside, where that's where their pass rush generated from. So the guys along the defensive line, I don't want to say they're just there, but they're there to do what they do, which is to occupy blockers and to be selfless. And they're not going to be guys who you're going to be writing about after a game about how they had all these sacks or made all these big plays. You're probably going to be writing more about the linebackers. But again, that's because of the defensive linemen. And you can ask the linebackers, like you said, it makes their job a lot easier when those guys are doing what they need to do. And I think we saw that, national championship game, Christian Harris had 2 sacks. It probably helped that he had Phil Mathis in front of him, helping him out. Will Anderson on the outside could be the number 1 overall pick next year. Probably helps that he has a guy like Mathis on the inside who defenses need to worry about coming up the middle. So yeah, it's all a piece of the puzzle. And I think that's probably what Mathis will be in the NFL as well, as a piece of that puzzle, when you have guys around him who can make plays and just have Mathis do what he does best, which I think is just occupy space and be a reliable guy in the middle.
Do you think people were saying, I don't know what were you hearing about his draft projection before the draft, and were people surprised that he went in the second round?
Yeah, I think second might have been a little bit earlier. I think even he mentioned it too, where he was expecting, or his agent was expecting
Well,
him
his
to go a little
agent
bit
said
later.
that, and then she was saying that she basically tried to lessen or manage expectations and not get him over excited about where he might go.
Mhm.
So, but I'd heard from some people that like they thought third round, after talking to a lot of teams,
Right.
but it was an average of the third round, which meant that some thought second and some thought maybe a little bit later. So, and this was all over the place. So, but what were you hearing and what were you thinking he might do?
Yeah, I was thinking third as well. Going back to what NFL teams kind of look for, if you're looking for a standout trait, from a defensive lineman, you're looking probably for him to be able to rush the passer and to have that sort of elite ability if he's going to go in the first round or a second round to have those traits. And I don't know if Mathis quite has those pass rush traits that would push him high in the draft like that, but the place in the draft where the reliable sort of less spectacular players tend to go is the third or the fourth round. And that's really where I had him picked or projected myself. Again, the second round, I don't know if there's a huge difference at the end of the day if he walks into the building as a second round pick versus a third round pick. In his mind, I'm sure it's not going to be too much different, but I think it's a fair. I don't think they overpicked him. I don't think it was a reach. I just think it was probably on the early side of the spectrum from where he was projected to go.
And one of the things they did talk about, like they felt like maybe he could help as a pass rusher. He got more sacks last year, so do they not see him necessarily in that way, or what traits might lead them to think that, and what would you say would be like, well, maybe not?
Yeah, I don't know if the quickness, in terms of being able to get around guys is there. I didn't see it personally. I don't know. I didn't really break down every play of his to look for that particularly. But if he's going to be rushing a passer, it's probably going to be more using his lower body as a good lower body base, just being built out that way. Being more of a bull rusher, I would say, using his hands a little bit more. Then he's going to be the guy who's going to use that quick first step and get it around the edge a little bit. So, I think there's some ability there. I don't think there's that top level potential with him to be, again, that sort of elite interior pass rusher, but I think he's capable of just being good enough in that category. I don't think he's ever going to be a standout pass rusher, though.
What about his personality? Because that's one of the things in our conference call with him, seemed like a very fun guy. And when Ron Rivera calls him for, I don't know how long it was, all you heard was after he told his family, all you could hear was the family going crazy. And Rivera's just kind of sitting there on the phone, just waiting for him to come back on, but they were going crazy. And then you see him a little bit of the personality on the field, a little bit of dancing and all that, which you would think that, with Alabama, that's like, oh, you don't know, do you see that as much? But what was his personality, either what you saw, what you dealt with, what you heard?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say that's accurate. He's a fun guy. I think it still had to happen within the confines of what Alabama is, and
right.
I don't think he was ever outrageous. On the field, I don't think he was ever. I don't think he ever did anything that would make Saban upset at him. Let's put it that way. Like, it was never anything outlandish.
He seemed like fun, though. He seemed like
right.
He was fun.
He's a fun guy. He's a guy who I think more than anything else they relied upon to talk to us, which at Alabama is there's only a small group of players that's true for. And the way Saban does it, and he's done it ever since he was at Michigan State, and Plaxico Burress had said something the week that they played Michigan as a freshman. Freshmen aren't allowed to talk at Alabama. So that takes away that whole category of players. And then of the players who are left, the upperclassmen, there's only 8 to 10, I would say, who Alabama really trusts to put out in front of the cameras. And we have no say on who they allow to us. There's no open locker room. So he was one of those few guys. So that kind of shows you what Saban thought of him in terms of representing his message and his program. And obviously it's a very tightly restricted program in terms of what they want to get out. So they trusted him in that regard. Again, they trusted him as a team captain. The other players in the team did. So, personality wise, I think he's mature. He's been was at Alabama for 5 years, has a child, spent a long time there. I think Saban really respects guys like that who He talks about it a lot now with sort of the proliferation of the transfer portal, guys who have the resiliency and is just sort of what he labels it as, but the toughness to kind of stick it out and stay, even though like the first year I got here in 2019, Mathis was not really a contributor at all on defense. He was kind of buried on the depth chart, and that was his third year. And nowadays you might have a player who transfers at that point, but he kind of stuck it out, stayed for a fourth year, stayed for a fifth year, and became a second round pick. And I think Saban really respects guys who have that long-term view instead of pulling the plug early.
Hold on 1 second. I've got to go sign for a package. Hold on one second.
You got it.
Well, he's also voted a captain or named a captain, voted a captain, however they do it. What traits would you see from him in that regard? And does it go back to the ability to stick it out and all that? But what traits as a captain would you guys see or hear about with him?
Right. So I think the biggest thing for Saban, especially these days, is as a captain, as a leader on the team, being able to tell other players that they're not doing something right, which he sees as something that is not that younger players coming up these days aren't as willing to do. And he might tie it to like social media these days where players are all about approval of others and likes and retweets and all that. But he says, if you're going to be a leader, you need to be able to tell other guys that you're not doing something right and you need to do it better, which that's why he loves Will Anderson. That's why Will Anderson's going to be a high pick next year. But I think Mathis was in that category as well, in terms of being able to tell the other guys on defense that they needed to step up. And there was a point early last year where that was very much true on defense. And they had some issues that they needed to work out. And, that's the trait that I think Saban looks for the most, is the willingness to say to somebody else, you're not doing it right. He's talked about it with Henry Ruggs. That's kind of the other example that he's brought up, is if somebody told Henry Ruggs you shouldn't be driving a car, then maybe that doesn't happen. And that's the sort of example that he tries to use with his players, and then tries to trickle down throughout the team and use guys like Mathis. And I think, Mathis was receptive to that role.
Another guy stuck it out is Brian Robinson, also a third round pick here. What is Washington getting in him, just as a player, as like the reputation and all that? What are they getting in him?
Yeah, so similar in terms of Saban liking him for sticking it out at Alabama. That was, in fact, I'd say the prime example whenever Saban talked about that last year, whenever he was talking about the transfer portal, was look what Brian Robinson did in terms of him staying for 5 years at Alabama, was behind a lot of good backs in terms of Josh Jacobs and then Najee Harris for a while, and didn't really play a whole lot for his first 3 years, just like Mathis, and then finally got his opportunity and had a good year. I'd say you kind of look back in totality over Saban's tenure at Alabama and look at who was their number one running back each year. Robinson's probably low on that list. He might be the lowest guy on that list. In fact, I think Najee Harris is more talented. Mm-hmm. Trent Richardson, obviously, Mark Ingram, Derrick Henry, Kenyon Drake. List. There's not a school that I think has produced better running backs over the last 15 years in Alabama. But that's not to say that Robinson's not an NFL caliber player, an NFL capable player. I just think he has a lower ceiling than some of those guys. I mean, Derrick Henry is a physical specimen, like Brian Robinson's not. Doesn't have the speed of some of those other guys, and is just a solid player. Again, solid, not spectacular, I think is probably the category that Robinson would fall under. A guy who, can get some tough yards, is certainly physical enough. He's built like it. Has that mentality where he wants to fight through a guy rather than run around him. And he's capable of breaking a few tackles and getting a 6-7 yard run out of what should have been a 3 or 4 yard run. But he's not the sort of guy who's going to break into open space and give you a 20, 30, 40 yard run with any sort of consistency. That's just not his style. It's not his athleticism. I don't think it is quite there. And he's the sort of guy who I think can reliably catch the ball out of the backfield. But again, he's not the sort of guy who's going to take a flare pass and turn it into a 50-yard gain. It's just, he doesn't have that capability in him. I think he can give you something in the blocking game as a pass protector.
You look pretty good in pass pro at times.
Yeah. And I think that could be his calling card in the NFL that will get him on the field a little bit on third downs. But the overall explosiveness, the overall big playability is not there, and that's why he was a mid-round pick versus an early round pick. But the durability, I think, is, it's always a double-edged sword with Alabama, because I think there's a stigma that if you spend a lot of time at Alabama, you have a lot of carries, your body's going to be worn down, you're going to be damaged goods by the time you get to the NFL. In his case, he didn't really play a whole lot his first couple of years, so that the mileage is not that high. But he, this past season, he played a lot. He took a lot of carries. He was their number one back. They had a ton of injuries at running back. They were using a wide receiver and a linebacker as his backups by the end of the year because they had no running backs left. And so, he had to take on a pretty big role, and that he was durable in doing so. And he even played through an injury in the Iron Bowl, had a calf injury that he played through. And then he ended up playing the next week against Georgia in the SEC championship game when a lot of people didn't think that he'd be ready to play. So there's a toughness factor with him, durability. Again, the overall ceiling, I would say, is lower. The overall explosiveness, athleticism is probably not quite there, but a guy who I think can play a role, at least on an NFL team.
And that's what they're looking for him to be, as one of their top three backs, and to give Antonio Gibson a break and all that. And one thing that stood out to me a little bit was he does seem to run with, through the hole pretty strong and some good cuts, and whether or not he's explosive, but understands how to get yards after contact, it seems. Is that pretty accurate, you think?
Yeah, I would agree. I think he's a smart player in terms of not trying to play outside of the confines of what he's capable of doing, which I think some running backs, I remember watching CJ Spiller in Buffalo. And I think for a while, CJ Spiller was capable of doing those things. And then after that, his physical skills kind of diminished, but he was still trying to be that player. LaShawn McCoy is probably in that category too in Buffalo that I watched. And you have guys who are just trying to be something different than what they are. I think Brian Robinson knows what he is. He stays within that box, and he knows that getting a 4 or 5 yard gain is perfectly fine, especially in Alabama's offense. That was perfectly fine, rather than trying to tuck it outside and try to turn it into a 10-yard gain, 15-yard gain, but then you get stopped and it's a loss. Right. Like, he really avoided those sort of negative plays, avoided those dumb plays as a running back. And I think they figured he was pretty reliable in that regard.
Last thing, we were talking about this before we got on here. What's it like covering Nick Saban? And you start off in New England too, so you were experienced with Belichick. What's it like covering Nick Saban?
Yeah, I know it's a question I often get, because I don't think there's too many people who have covered both.
No.
I think Ian Rappaport might be the only other one, because he covered Alabama for a little while and then covered the Patriots. And it's different. I would say, like, Bill Belichick's very closed off. You're not going to get much of an answer for him on most questions. I think we all know that. You're not going to get, sometimes it's just a grunt or a noise, or, a head shake or whatever it is with him. Nick Saban's going to answer your question, which is good for us. I mean, you ask him about injuries, he's going to tell you the injury. You ask him about how a player played, he's going to give you a pretty honest answer. He's going to give you what you want. But Nick Saban, where he gets this reputation and where he sort of gets on SportsCenter a little bit, is when he has these blow-ups, which is almost always because of the way a question is phrased. And so that's where you have to be, I think, most careful with Saban, or most strategic with Saban, is just how you phrase your question to sort of avoid the blow up that sort of distracts from what you're actually trying to ask about. And that sometimes is a little bit tricky with him, because he hates hypotheticals and he hates comparisons between players. But you can still accomplish what you want to accomplish as a question asker, and just try to work within what he'll react to. And he's very reactive to certain questions. And again, that's different to Belichick. I think Belichick is just unreactive. He just will give you absolutely nothing. He's very stoic, whereas Saban, I think, is a little more expressive and will offer an opinion a little bit more. So that's been good. But it's Saban's program at this point. He's 70 years old. He's the most powerful person in this state. It's just, he can keep coaching as long as he wants to keep coaching. He knows that he has all of the control and the power they could possibly want or ever have here. And you're just sort of along for the ride. It's just sort of the way it is, and you kind of have to accept that a little bit as a journalist.
And real quick, summing it up, did Washington make good picks with Robinson and Mathis?
Yeah, I think they did. I think if you're looking for the more reliable picks in terms of Alabama and projecting them to the NFL and what their roles will be, I think they're probably high on that list of Alabama players where you're not having to guess what they might be, or not dealing with injury issues, which Alabama had a lot of players in this draft who had injury issues.
Yeah.
Mathis and Robinson were the two that didn't. And they were also the two that had stayed for 5 years at Alabama, and again, showed some of those leadership qualities and resiliency qualities that I think will help them out in the NFL. They're not spectacular players. They're probably not guys who are going to go to multiple Pro Bowls, but I think that they're players who, can play a role at the NFL level and be reliable, stay healthy, do the right things on and off the field, and just, do what they need to do essentially. And that's what you want.
Mike, appreciate your insight. Very good. Thanks for coming on. And it's good to see you, man.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Hey, everybody, it's John Keim. Do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, and I'll continue to bring you guests who provide excellent insight into the Washington Commanders. And while you're here, check out the other terrific content on the Ampire Media Network, including Inside the Cap with Joel Corey and All's Caps with Steve Wino and former Washington Capital Carl Alsner. Go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Thank you.